crazy environment of the ever-evolving cybersecurity landscape and help them to reduce the risks to their businesses. As always, following each discussion with our expert panelists, we will open up the forum to questions. So if something strikes you during today's conversation, be sure to put your questions in the chat and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can with the time that's permitted. So let's get ready to rumble. Today, we are going to discuss the risks of personal information on internal systems. And first, I'd like to introduce to you, if I could grab it here, one of our co-founders and PulseOne partner, Chad Wiggins. Bring you in, Chad. And from AvePoint, we have Connor Dean. He is the manager of solutions engineering. Let me grab you. It's kind of, wish I had another hand here. Here we go. Boom. Hey, Connor.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the introduction.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to step aside and let you gentlemen take center stage. So start your engines and go.
All right, everyone. Thanks again, Eric, for the introduction. Chad here with PulseOne. Yes, we're going to talk about the risks of personal information on internal systems. Backing up a little bit, this year alone, in 2022, the first half of 2022, we've had 136, or the US has had 136 million cyber attacks, with the average cost going from about 100,000 to 250,000 per cyber attack. And that's all in with paying the ransom, paying for the technical staff to do the incident response, to nuke and pave the technology, everything with the company outage, all of it in. It's about statistics are showing it's about 100,000 to 250,000 per incident. We're also showing that a little over 30% of all small businesses that get cyber attacked are not coming back, completely going out of business after they're ransomed or the cyber attack has happened. A lot of it has to do with cyber insurance, not having all the cyber insurance they need, or cyber insurance not paying because the company doesn't have the right technology. And the bad guys are looking for, during their attacks, during the ransom, they are looking for personal information within business IT systems so they can keep attacking other companies and other people. So I've got Connor here with AvePoint, excited to have him. Connor, beginning of his career was core infrastructure of IT, active duty, and then subcontracting for the Navy. Then he jumped over into our world, the MSP world, and now he's with AvePoint. So thanks again, Connor, for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chad. Looking forward to the conversation.
Cool. So Connor, how did we get here? How did we get to where we're at with that? The personal information is such a big deal on IT systems and business infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you kind of said it at the top there where you're saying, we understand we have some sort of sensitive data inside of our environment, right? And we used to feel okay about it at one point back when it was on file shares that, we can run to the closet and unplug it, right? We had some sort of feeling to that, but then it's evolved now when we talk about going to the cloud, right? So a lot of the things you were talking about before saying, look, attacks are on the rise, right? So me as an organization, some of the biggest changes we went through is that we went to the cloud and we started giving end users a lot more control than they previously had, right? So what does that mean? On a more technical level, we're looking at something like a file share or a server or a laptop where my files are stored, right? And then I can control the permissions to those documents, right? And I normally did that through some sort of, security group or some sort of membership identity for that user, right? That controlled what files you could access on the actual server. When we talk about going to something like M365, the owners of that content has kind of shifted, right? We talk about SharePoint owners, right? We talk about group owners. We talk about Teams owners, right? And that's not necessarily an IT role anymore, right? And what's now happened is the content not paywall, but access wall, right? It shifted from being something we used to handle on the front end as IT members and has now been kind of delegated out to the business users, right?
Right. And like Teams, like Microsoft Teams, when Microsoft rolled it out for free to everybody during the pandemic.
Right.
So I'm sure that's created this chaos of personal information on IT systems.
Yeah, so I mean, you said it right there, right? It's a combination of a couple things, right? A black swan economic event where everyone's working remotely, right? We have B2B collaboration rising, right, which is great. We have a lot of hybrid tools available for the hybrid workspace to make sure that the organization is still running. All of these are great things, but what we've kind of discovered through that are the bounds or controls that I have over who can see what data inside of my environment has kind of started to melt away even further than just the end user accessing this content, right? If we take something like Teams in really deep focus, right? Let's think about just a regular user workflow. I might be working on a customer proposal, right? I'm going to be drafting this document and it's just in a Word format. I haven't made it into a PDF yet. But I might be working with somebody else in this document as well. I might be sending it to you or my boss, right? And kind of just checking. And I'm sometimes doing that through email. I'm sometimes doing that through Teams chats, right? So when we talk about Teams has changed things, we're seeing users start to use Teams chats internally. But where does that file go if I share it over Teams chats, right? Where does the actual data live? Well, it lives on the user's OneDrive who shared that originally, right? So it's not even inside of Teams, right? So when we start to think about like how many layers the onion has to it, right? We can even go further in the other direction. Let's say, you know what? I make Teams for all of my customers. Anytime we do any sort of opportunity together, right? I want them to be able to engage us through the proposal, right? But I might have a private channel inside of one of those teams, right? With unique membership. The data doesn't get stored on the same site collection that team is on. It's on a whole separate one for the private channel. So ultimately what it comes down to is, you know, from a draft workflow stage to a proposal workflow stage, right? You could have an instance where sensitive data, right, information you don't want shared publicly, it lives in 3 different locations with 3 different versions of itself, right? And then we add in what Teams brings with it, which is, again, a really great viral solution that has guest access invite controls delegated out to end users at times, right? We have things like Delve where people can see what you're working on just being an internal user inside the environment, right? Depending on their relationship and proxy membership to your teams and your group. So that's really what we're kind of finding is that the conversation when we talk about not only do we take the file share and put it to the cloud, we had end users own a lot of that story of who can access what. And then we have things like private channels and chat that kind of evolve and make it a little bit more murky. So the question starts to be, you know, who has access to what inside of my environment? We have to be a little bit more prescriptive on where does the data even go in your environment, right? So Teams chats go to OneDrive, Teams data go to SharePoint on the back end, those sort of pieces. We're doing a lot of education around, especially with the new era of the hybrid workforce.
So yeah, it went from more of a walled off city where the IT department had full control. And if you needed access from the outside, it was you put a ticket in, you got requested the permission, you got access, maybe you got a VPN, very structured approach to digital transformation story of Google Workspace, Office 365, data out there. And then each user having the ability to share that data with anybody that they choose, right? And yeah. Microsoft didn't lock that down, or still hasn't really locked that down, right? It's up to you right. as the internal IT department or MSP or the business to know what they're doing on how to lock it down and have correct guest access and all that.
And so that's a great point, right? To kind of talk about what you said at the beginning too, that the process changed from IT was involved from the beginning to now IT's catching up, right? Because I mean, think about it in the on-premise days. If we hired somebody new, we would say, hey, make sure they're a part of this security group and have my permission so they can access the team files on the network share, right? And they have a U drive so that way they can do it long before OneDrive, right? That's now we're playing catch up, right? We have a new user onboarded. They're a part of groups and teams, right? But then they can just start adding people to it, right? And, you know, downloading things or whatever they need to do. But then even for like, how is IT kind of controlling some of that, right? It's kind of an all in or all out, right? We can kind of control which teams are set to private or public, but what's really happening is what does guest access look like at the top level in the tenant, right? So we're either using and saying, hey, for Teams, guest user access on or off, right? That's not necessarily always going to have the best outcome for your business users, right? When they're saying, look, I need to work across tenants with these customers. We do have these edge cases. We would love to say this tenant is for internal communication only. We're going to, all outbound's gone, but that story, especially in the new hybrid workforce, that's not here to stay. That's kind of evolving into the past, right?
Right. Yeah. So what creates this risk, having this personal information on internal systems? Why are the bad guys looking for that? What is that risk that you guys are seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the things we were talking about at the top, right? So we know that if we talk about just a threat that most everyone understands, is something like ransomware, right? If we take that same idea of I have a salesperson working on a proposal or a number of proposals all at the same time, or an accounting person drafting up a couple of different budget statements, right? If their data gets locked down or encrypted in a ransomware attack, right, we need to kind of have some sort of remediation path for that, right? They need to be able to handle and say, not only am I under attack, but my business can still run, right? That's the difference in how we're kind of having a lot of education conversations around this, right? So things like ransomware are definitely out there today. We've seen those, take 30% or more spikes on, how frequent these attacks are happening. We're seeing SMB customers, right? Small, medium, mid-sized businesses specifically being targeted the most for this, right? Either because of a success frequency, right? Or just again, they've gone to the cloud and we just have some challenges in understanding like what is our threat vector, right? And then, we just have user behavior pieces, right? Because again, IT is on the back end for this scenario when we talk about who can access what and, who can create teams, who can make these environments where people can share things. So that's another scenario that's kind of happened at the same time. So not only did everyone like rush or fast track into Teams, right? But sometimes if they weren't necessarily given the best guidance, they're going to run into sprawl issues later on. We used to call it in SharePoint, we called it a content black hole, right? It would be a single site up at the top and then a subsite and subsite and subsite and subsite. And down all the way at the bottom was all of my sensitive data. And I didn't see the permissions. It was buried. It's not in like top level reporting that I had. So those are some of the things that we're seeing kind of endanger a lot of different organizations of all types, right? Kind of regardless of vertical or size, that everyone's kind of saying, okay, knowing these things, right? How am I handling my sensitive data, right? Like, how am I supposed to do that?
So, but hold on, like I'm in the cloud. All my data is in the cloud. It's in Microsoft's cloud, and don't they have backups? Doesn't Office 365, doesn't Google Workspace, don't they have backups? So if anything happens, the reason why I went from on-premise technology to the cloud technology is because there's disaster recovery and I'll be fine. Won't I be fine if I get attacked if I'm in the cloud?
Yeah. Right. So that's a good question. So again, when we think of the cloud, it's important to, say what the cloud actually is, right? It's not necessarily that you're going there for data redundancy, right? You're going there for service redundancy. So let's go back to, again, let's say it's the early 2000s, right? We have all of our file shares lying around. We have our NAS storage and everything else. And we have an uptime of 95%. We pat ourselves up on the back, right? 95% is not that great sometimes, right? Especially as organizations continue to scale and become a lot larger. So they're going to say, hey, look, I need 99.8% uptime for this NAS storage. So we went to the cloud, right? So we're talking about service redundancy. You don't have to have Exchange servers on premise plugged in with, UPS power systems behind them, making sure we have continuity, right? Separate demarcation points with my ISP to make sure I can access this, right? I can go home and 99.8% of the time, I'm able to get to Outlook, Teams, right? My data. So we have a service level redundancy with the cloud. What the customer is still responsible for, and Microsoft has this in their own services agreement, their own recommendation. It's in their like section 6, paragraph B, right? Of saying, we recommend for your data to, protect that separate, because there are outages, right? And we talk about something like we were talking about before with ransomware, right? That's not even like data being deleted. I can actually still see the file there, but it's encrypted, right? And the only person who can access that is the person who encrypted that in the first place. So am I paying the ransomware while I'm doing my investigation and ripping out all the different current sessions that I have for that user to prevent any further complications? So that's kind of the landscape. So yes, there are recycle bins where if we make deletions at a top level, right, I could get an entire site collection back. Some of the issues we've seen around that one specifically is a customer might say, hey, I don't want to just get the whole site collection back, right? I just want to get this Teams channel with the tabs it had, or I just want to get this planner task back, or this security group. I don't want to revert everything, right? Because there's potentially a larger change that's going around that RTO, RPO of how we're recovering that data, right? So those are some of the things that we encourage our customers to understand, right? When they look at their data protection strategy, understanding what's available to you through the recycle bin and making sure that matches the SLA that you're offering, either as an internal IT organization or just as somebody who says, if I'm going to be down, right, how long can I afford to be down? That's the other question, right?
Downtime tolerance. Yeah,
that's it, right? So it could be an outage at a user level. It could be an outage at a organization level, team, division, department, you name it, right? So how much does that cost when I say accounting's out for the week, right? Because we had hit with a ransomware attack on a site collection, right? Or we had to roll back and we lost a week's worth of work. How much does that cost, right? Outside of just general practice on data governance and data ownership separate, right? Because we've been talking about this for a long time. In IT, you're really only as good as your last backup, right? And if you don't have an IT department, that's pretty much how good your data is just as a whole, right? It's only as good as its last backup. Traditionally, that means having something somewhere else, right? Having it, back in the day was tapes, right? It was hard copy, hard drives we would send somewhere else and then eventually zero them out with like drills, right? So, but that world's kind of evolved now, right? So when we talk about having something separate from my active data that could be attacked, as a good copy that I can restore from.
So talk to me about the difference between Microsoft's native backup solution, backup recovery versus AvePoint. PulseOne, we use AvePoint. We're an AvePoint partner. We've drank the Kool-Aid. We use it internally. We use it with our customers, and hands down, it's far better of a solution than trying to do disaster recovery, backups, retention, all that natively within Microsoft. So tell us a little bit of the difference between what Microsoft gives you out of the box versus an AvePoint solution.
Yeah, so out of the box, right, we just say regardless of licensing, right, you're going to be able to have access to something called a recycle bin, right, that protects against actions we call deletions, but on the back end, we'll call them like a soft delete action, for example, right? I have this file, I'm inside of a site collection, I'm inside of a library or a folder, and I just hit delete, right? On the back end, in every single site, there is a folder or a recycle bin available for the end user to get that content back, or the administrator of that SharePoint instance. Same thing for Exchange, right? If I pull data out, there's a way for me to get some of that back. And each workload, Teams, SharePoint, Groups, Exchange, they have different levels of how much retention they offer, right? But also different levels of depth, right? So let's say, for example, here's a classic scenario, right? Let's say I offboard a user, right? And I pull their licensing off, right? Then what happens with that is that after my recycle bin window's off, right? Which let's say at a max across workloads, we're looking at 93 days, right? If I pull the licensing off that user, that data is gone, right? There's no way for me to get that back, right? And that's why you hear so many customers say, that's not our process, right? We'll go ahead and convert it to a shared mailbox, then pull the licensing off so we can keep the mailbox indefinitely, right? And that's totally fine. But let's talk about where downtime now lives, right? Downtime might be at the document level, version level, planner level, conversation team level, right? So there's different outage costs that can definitely start to stack up when we talk about not just a granular recovery, but then again, things like workload recovery, right? Hey, I have a series of mailboxes that I can't access. It's been encrypted. All the versioning doesn't really protect me in the world if I have that turned on in my environment, right? How do I get this user back to what they were? How do I get, a PST file to go back and analyze whether or not someone said, Las Vegas in a set period of time in a series of emails, right? Like, so how do I get that information regardless of what the user behavior is inside of the environment to where I don't have to pretend that I'm really on top of those things, right? Because I'm not going to see all those changes. IT's playing a lot of catch up to those. So that's where our solution will be able to kind of, again, provide things like unlimited retention, right? To kind of speak to those values. But then on the flip side of that, going to the cloud means we likely went to the cloud for service redundancy. I didn't want to go set up a bunch of infrastructure to go to the cloud, right? So the same thing goes for storage. So it's not just unlimited retention, it's unlimited storage, right? Being able to hold on to my data as much as possible for as long as possible, as it makes sense for us as an organization, right? Then there's other things like self-service we can get into, but that's another thing that I think that, we just talked about the backup or restore differences, right? The customers seem to have a lot of, really good things. And obviously your team is really up to speed on where those kind of technical differences lie, right? But it's a really good point for us to cover here.
Well, yeah, and the how granular you can get with an AvePoint restore versus a native restore, like within Microsoft. So tell me a little bit more about that, like say one email versus a whole mailbox.
Right. Yeah. So the question is when I think of, hey, let's say something changed, right, inside of my environment. If I made some permission changes, right, I'm not able to say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and recover the site collection against this point for these permission changes without blowing up all the work, right? Because if we look at a team, for example, right, people are posting conversations inside of the team on the back end. There's a SharePoint site that's holding all the files, right? But if somebody modifies permissions to a folder or something else, like, how do I just recover that? We're not even talking about the content at that point, right? Just You need things like just a rollback, right? Or, hey, I can't get into, my tenant right now for whatever reason, right? But I still need to have this Excel file to work with locally while I wait for the updates to go to the cloud. We can export that content out of the backup, right? It doesn't have to go back to the cloud. So when we think about like saying, hey, does my disaster recovery protect me to where I can be functional for active projects for our users, regardless if they can access M365, right? Or in the event of attack, or in the event of, I don't want to just bring back the whole site collection. I made a change at a lower level, or I deployed a solution I need to roll back to without, more or less destroying others' work.
And then AvePoint has, I believe you guys were first to market on detecting ransomware within Office 365 backups as well.
Correct. So one of the things we started doing is the way that our solution works is that we do Delta backups consistently, right? Which means we're able to see the amount of change that an environment has, right? So after your first 12 backups, we'll be able to say, this is roughly the amount of files that change for this customer, right? What that does is it's really useful because when we look at something like a ransomware attack, a user is normally like doing a OneDrive sync, right, from their endpoint, right? The device gets attacked, the files get encrypted, and that syncs up to the cloud, right? If I see that 3,000 files for Bob just got encrypted, right, we're going to go ahead and notify the administrator, right? So that's something our solution is just doing out of the box, where we'll say, hey, look, this is well against the threshold for encryption. This is a potential ransomware attack. Here's a conservative recovery point that you can actually get your data back from while you're conducting your investigation on how that user's identity is compromised, right? So those are some of the things that we just have as a part of our solution just out of the box today, but also extending into the same sort of behavior into SharePoint, and then not just encryption, right? Because that's not the only danger. Sometimes we just have internal users who say, I'm deleting all my data, right? So deleted files, they've added files, modified files, or encrypted files, any of those sort of, potential attack sort of vectors, we'll go ahead and look at that against the change rate expected inside of your environment up to 4 times a day.
That's terrific. So we painted the picture on how you need more than what Microsoft gives you natively in Office 365 and what Google gives you natively as well. So where do we go from here? How do we get a handle on everything regarding permissions and backups and security breaches? How do we get a handle on where we're at within Office 365?
Right. So this is why, again, AvePoint, partners with PulseOne on this, because PulseOne, you guys are a thought leader in a lot of these areas, right? On the main thing we kind of started this conversation on, which is like the risk of sensitive data or personally identifiable information on my internal systems, right? So if I look at this, I need to start from a couple of different places, right? I need to know where this is, right? I need to know what's at risk for me inside of my environment. And I need to be able to have a good way to consistently check up on that, right? So that's where we need to start. Is we need to kind of take a quick look at some of the threat vectors we were just talking about today, and being able to see that at bird's eye view and saying, okay, do I have a guest user, right? Do I have, some sort of external sharing, right? So this is something that the PulseOne has, right, as a risk assessment service today, right, to be able to look at your M365 environment, see what kind of data is overexposed. Is it sensitive data? Is it just your, travel policy, right, that doesn't really bother anybody? And making sure that we can prioritize and focus on those exact specific use cases where we say, look, this is the data that's at risk, right? And then start to have conversations and thought leadership around what is our data protection strategy, our data governance strategy, to make sure that we understand not just what we're using, what's overexposed, what's protected, but when do we not need it anymore, right? So those are some of the pieces that, again, the PulseOne team has a really good history around, and being able to work with that, obviously partnering with us to be able to make sure we can execute on some of these things more tactically. But again, commending your entire team on what we've worked on so far with that.
Right. Yeah. And running the policies and insights with AvePoint. AvePoint has a terrific solution, PI, policies and insights, that does a risk assessment across the entire Office 365 tenant. That gives you exactly that information that you need. And then we're able to work with AvePoint, work with the tool to mitigate the problems, the external users, the personal information, the social security numbers, all that information. AvePoint's able to pull that out, show you where it's at, and we're able to lock it down, fix the problem, and then go one step further is change the policy so then it's fixed going forward, which that part's nice. So you're not coming back and trying to clean the room every 30 days or 90 days or whatever it is. You've fixed the problem for the most part going forward, right?
Yep. And I think beyond that too, we were talking about at the top, right? We have some of these controls in Microsoft, right? But they're kind of all in or out, right? The light switch effect, right? Where PulseOne can be a lot more prescriptive and say, look, these are obviously the customer teams that need to have guest users. Let's control who owns those, right? What kind of identity should even be there? How do we automate that to where I don't have to go back, like you were saying, and kind of, reset the guardrails on the bowling lane, right? Every single time someone goes up to bat. So some really good things. I think some other things too, and Chad, we could talk about this, or just like, what are some ways, that I can see kind of where I stack up against this, right? Some ways that are a little bit self-identifying on kind of like where I rate on this. If you would like, I go ahead and share on my screen now.
Yeah,
to kind of start.
Go for it.
It might be disabled for me, right? So I might just speak to them. So Eric, sorry to put you on the spot here, right? To kind of talk through some of these, but it's nothing crazy, right? I don't have an entire novel here for us, but I think what we could do is I'm going to go ahead and just start modifying the sharing settings here so I can start talking.
Yeah, no problem.
2 seconds. But some of those ways that I can check, right? Like what it is that I'm responsible for my organization. How is it that I know kind of where we stand in this, right? Or when is it time to start raising my hand and saying, let's partner with PulseOne to kind of resolve some of these things, right? So one of the first questions we could just ask ourselves is, do we know where all of our sensitive data is, right? Is this something that we can keep a good inventory of, right? We understand what kind of data it is, and being able to just, again, have a good understanding of what the kind of risk is, right? We need to be able to say what kind of data we're using and storing on our internal systems today. Do we know who has access to our sensitive data, right? That's always the follow-up question. If we're able to answer both of these questions, right, where we're a growing practice, we have some really good understanding on, data governance and data operations, especially when it relates to something in the cloud like M365, right? So if I'm able to answer both of these, we're in a growing position. We're a little bit more mature when we understand we have a review cadence, right? When we say, access to sensitive information, things that if they were to be shared externally, right, it would be financially or brand damaging to our organization, right, that we want to make sure it can be prevented from the outset. So we need to have somebody responsible for that. And IT ultimately carries that bucket to be able to be responsible to answer for that. Right. Goes back to that old story. We got stuck with this responsibility because we had the file shares. Right. So that's what's happening now in the cloud as well. And then we see a little bit more of an advance when we understand that, hey, memberships reviewed by business users. Right. We see this as more of an advanced understanding of saying this is how we can kind of set to rails what users are accessing this data or have access to this information at scales, because IT is going to have to deal with 300, 3,000, 300,000 teams alone, right? Let alone site collections and OneDrives and everything else, right? And then again, understanding what our remediation strategy is for compromised identities, right? The reason why we kind of put this around that leading practice is because as I'm going through these questions, if I'm taking these questions back to my organization and saying, how do we stack up, right? And being able to be responsible about our sensitive data, this is a really good guideline to say, how do we look at something like zero trust, right? Because that's what we're really talking about here. If you're not familiar with zero trust, there's the idea of one of the core tenets is assume breach, right?
Right.
You're assuming that, if I assume that Chad's account gets breached, right? And sorry for that, Chad, I attacked your account, right? What does Chad have access to inside of our environment that would now put us at risk, right? So if I use the tendency of assume breach, these sort of questions start to come up in line with that. So when we talk about zero trust, that's what we're talking about, is the ability to say, I understand the threat vector from the data side, right? What sensitive data we have, all the way to the end user side, and then our remediation strategy around that, right? So that's where some of the things we're working with. And obviously, PulseOne has a lot of ideas on kind of the thought leadership here on those pieces and how to kind of build a framework to achieve kind of a zero trust security architecture or framework for your M365 collaboration to other clouds.
That's perfect. Yeah, I think that having that plan, incident response plan, having the remediation strategy, I think that's actually one of the cyber insurance requirements too. Is a new requirement that's coming out is having an incident response plan to get the full value of your cyber insurance. So yeah, thank you. This is great, Connor. So I think we're Eric, I think we're ready to go into our Q&A time.
Q&A, here we go. By the way, Connor, awesome information, really great. And to all those playing along at home, AvePoint, like Chad said, we drank the Kool-Aid a long time ago. It's brilliant. So user-friendly too. That's what I love about it. Because full transparency, I am not a technician, but AvePoint, it's so easy to use. Any business owner should really think about it. All right, let me see. There's a couple here, but let me see. Well, this is pretty straightforward. We've been talking a lot about Office 365. We're in Google Workspace. Should we move to Office 365?
Well, that really depends. We try and stay pretty technology agnostic, and in whatever's we want you to use the technology that's best for you, for the business. So it would be a kind of a larger question for the business. What does it mean moving from like Google Workspace to Office 365? I personally would tell you, yes, you should, but probably technically not supposed to do that. There's just a lot of, go ahead, Connor.
No, I was going to say, regardless of whatever cloud you're in, and this is something, we do because we offer data protection with PulseOne on all of those fronts, right? So not just for M365, but for Google, Salesforce, Dynamics. So even if you stay inside of Google, right, the same sort of questions apply. What is my remediation strategy if I have a compromised identity, right? To the larger question of if you should move, again, that depends on sort of your collaboration focus, right? So what are some of the feature sets that are a requirement for you as an organization? What sort of compliance needs you may have to make sure that your data is protected, and making sure that the licensing you have from your cloud provider aligned to that. In both scenarios, though, we're still looking at the same sort of limitations with recycle bins. So making sure that I have a remediation path for any sort of event, either if it's end user, administrative, or some sort of malicious actor, right, that I can start to handle that as an organization.
Cool. Okay. Connor mentioned Sprawl. Could you define that more? And there's another question that's, my company saves a lot of documents and we haven't deleted archived files in years. Outside of poor housekeeping, does this pose a risk? I think that's kind of related to Sprawl, but can you define Sprawl more?
Yeah, so you'll hear Sprawl used in two contexts mainly, especially like M365, Google, it really doesn't matter, but Sprawl at a data level means exactly what you're talking about, right? We have a litany of files that we, kept even when we went to the cloud that are from, 2001, right? That we had on file shares that we, migrated in the cloud, but nobody's accessed them since 2008, right? So that's a data sprawl. Something that we've seen that's posed an issue more specifically in the cloud is something like workspace sprawl, right? So that would be the scenario of any user can create a team, right? Any user can create a site collection because we want them to be able to set up these places and start working with their customers and peers to be able to collaborate quickly, especially in asynchronous working schedules, right? Different time zones we're trying to balance. So they'll create these workspaces, but then IT is still stuck with the bag of saying, what is this team for, right? They'll go to the teams, then they'll look at the list and they'll say Canada, right? Canada what? Sales, right? Mark, what is this for? What kind of data goes here? What kind of user access should be here? So those are some of the challenges that IT has when we talk about workspace sprawl. And again, PulseOne has a whole, governance strategy on managing some of these pieces from a data perspective as well, though, right? We need to have some sort of way to remove this data, right? If it's not being accessed, even if that's just our floor, nobody's used this data in 5 or more years, right? We need to have a process of purging that, right? Not only to make sure we're saving on storage costs against our SharePoint licensing, right? Because that's something that is not unlimited, right? It does have a cap to it, but then also for the threat vector, right? If you're not understanding what sort of archaic data you're holding on to, or if it's sensitive at all, we're right back to square one, right? Because now you've not just given them a single user's OneDrive of what they've been working on the past year, but what the organization has been touching for the past decade plus, right? So making sure we have a good understanding of what sort of assets we carry is important to that.
Well, also we've seen where we've been referred to companies that have been breached, and because they got breached, they had sensitive data regarding their clients, and then their client got breached, and they were the nucleus
right.
of their clients being breached. So
yep. That's a really good point, right? Because let's say that file is a file that I have for customer B, right? In most areas, I'm legally bound to let customer B know that data related to them was compromised, right, or breached, right, which again goes back to the legal cost, right, or financial penalties, as well as brand damage we could face with having a lot of legacy data that may not even be used anymore.
All
right. We got another question. This will probably be our last one because we're starting to run out of time here. If my company uses Office 365 for some things and Google Workspace for others, what risk, if any, am I increasing because of competing products and the workspace sprawl? Because the workspace sprawl and Google Workspace is starting to get out of hand due to how email attachments are shared between internal team members and clients. So is there a solution that covers both, or?
No, not really. You have to manage both. And Connor, I don't know if you have another answer too, but you basically have to have IT permission administration over within your Office 365, and you got to do the due diligence and make sure you have that within your Google Workspace permission. So you're definitely doubling the effort if you're in both systems.
Yeah, so that's really it, right? I have a set number of resources to make sure that I'm secure and that everything's running, right? I'm spreading that over 2 tenancies, right? Whether it's Google or M365, and we see this in the defense industry as well, right? Well, they'll make a separate tenant for all their CUI data, right? That's more controlled or secret. So they'll make these enclaves. Now it's 2 tenants that they're managing, right? So this is something that, again, same sort of risk where I'm just trying to have the same sort of attention, but spread over 2 environments, right? From content to permissions to the IT operations behind that.
Well put. Well put. Gentlemen, any final thoughts?
Yeah, final thought would be PulseOne. We have a risk assessment that we can run on your tenants and come up with where are all the gaps, where are the holes, where are the vulnerabilities, external users, personal information, social security numbers, health insurance, all of that information. We can run that risk assessment on the tenant and help you define where those problems are, fix them, and then put systems in place to where you're safe going forward.
Yeah, and I would say, again, for like things like detection, remediation, protection, kind of being those tendencies that IT is trying to build up right now for M365, right? PulseOne's a great organization to partner with when we start looking at those, especially when we start saying, hey, I don't want to just look at it from the data side, but I also need to go from like kind of a zero trust model and look at what my users could be impacting, even if it's not their fault and they just get attacked, right? What does that kind of assume breach model look like for us? So again, PulseOne's a great organization that has a lot of thought leadership around being able to kind of build that roadmap and execute towards that.
Thank you for that, Connor. And the feeling is mutual. Really,
Definitely.
it absolutely is. And thank you to both Chad and Connor. Our IT security series continues every Wednesday through November 16th. Next week, we'll be talking with KnowBe4's data-driven defense evangelist, Roger Grimes, about reducing security risk through employee training. Same bat time, same bat channel. And if you have any further questions, you can contact Chad at cwiggins@pulseone.com or me at eanslow@pulseone.com, or you can certainly contact us at the website, pulseone.com. And with that, I just want to thank everyone who's playing along at home. And again, Connor and Chad, thank you so much.
Thanks, Connor. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, until next week.